Welcome to the Backyard Bounty Podcast from HeritageAcresMarket.com, where we aim to educate and inspire you by sharing practical information to help your homestead thrive. And now, here's your host, Nicole.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Backyard Bounty. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I'm joined by Paola with Sage Creations Organic Farm, and today we are going to talk about growing lavender, whether it's for your own purposes or if you want to take things a little bit larger scale. So, Paola, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk lavender. I have some that I've grown here, and I've dreamed of having a larger scale lavender grow in my extra acreage out here. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this today. But before we dive into that, can you tell me a little bit more about how you got into growing lavender and your background with that?
Sure. Well, my husband and I, we moved to Colorado now about 16 years ago, and my background was in farming, and when we moved here, we were wanting to live in an agricultural area where we would be able to have a small farm, and we ended up landing in Palisade, Colorado, which is mainly known for tree fruit, particularly peaches, and more recently, wine grapes. When we bought the property that we now live on, we inherited a cherry orchard, sweet cherry trees. And knowing that I didn't really want to grow peaches because there were a lot of peach growers around our surrounding area, I was looking for potentially an alternative crop for the long run, like, beyond cherries, and had a background in herbs and culinary herbs and row crops. And I did notice that a few people had some lavender plants in their garden. And I thought, well, that actually is interesting. I wonder how lavender would do on a larger scale. And here we are in the Western Slope. Our farm's at 4,800 feet. So we're high desert. And thinking that, lavender does well in marginal soil, because basically where wine grapes can grow, you can grow lavender as well. And we have a lot of full sun and sunny days, kind of rocky marginal soil, and our pH is a little bit higher. And lavender can do well and actually can thrive in kind of an alkaline soil. And so I decided to do a trial, and that's how it all started. And I started with 40 plants, and now we are almost close to 6 acres of lavender and growing 3 species and about over 45 different cultivars. I've lost count because it definitely becomes a collection. I'm doing always doing trials of seeing what we can grow in our area and what we can grow in Colorado and the Rocky Mountains and the high desert. So I'm constantly trying new cultivars. So that's how we started. It definitely grew organically, and so to speak, in the sense of I started with 40, and then the next year I planted 1,500 plants, and then it just kind of continually grew. And in that process, I developed and figured out how to develop a market as well.
So with that many plants, what is your main production? Do you sell just the herbs, or do you produce things with the lavender?
We do everything. I mean, lavender is one of these plants that has so many applications. And so I actually have a market for all different aspects. If it's a lavender that we're growing that's really great to use for culinary purposes, that's used in food products or to cook with. So we grow for that. We also grow for fresh bundles, fresh cut flowers, for dried flower bundles, for the potpourri. And then essential oils, we distill here on the farm for the essential oils, and also the distillates or the hydrosols, so the floral waters that come out of the still. We do all of it. And even a step further is we grow the bedding plants as well. So not only for ourselves, but for gardeners and for other growers. And we have a very large collection of, like I mentioned in the beginning, of a number of different cultivars that kind of a unique offering that you wouldn't find at your, just regular garden center. And then, just over the years, we've kind of gradually grown where we do grow for other growers. So we do it all. We use the plant in many different ways and to process it in many different ways.
How neat. So you mentioned that you have a number of different varietals. So when it comes to trying to select which one would be best for our own uses, how do we go about that?
Well, a lot of it that you have to see what your growing conditions are, what growing zone are you in. Here in Colorado, we can predominantly grow two species, and that's the true lavender, or the Lavandula angustifolia, or the lavandin, which is a hybrid, and that's a cross between Lavandula angustifolia and a latifolia, which is a spike lavender. So it's a cross between a true lavender and a spike lavender. And those two species, fortunately, are the ones that are most commercially viable as well. And so you need to know your growing zone. If you live in a warmer climate, I'm in a 5A, 5B growing zone. And as I said, our elevation is 4,800. Depending on your elevation and how your winters are. So your angustifolias or your true lavenders are going to be your most cold hardy plants. So those are the ones that you would grow if you're even in a colder region than I am. We can grow both, but those are definitely the most hardy and do the best in our climate. So you need to look at that, your growing zone is, what your interests are, and what you would like. Why do you want to plant lavender? If you're a gardener, is it just going to be wanting to have it as part of your landscape? Do you want it as a pollinator plant? Because it's a wonderful plant for pollinators to incorporate in your garden. Or do you want to grow it commercially? Then what would you like to sell? Is it the essential oils? Is it the fresh cut flowers? Is it for culinary purposes? So those decisions or interests will dictate your choice in the species, and then within that species, which cultivars. Within the species, there's, especially in the true lavender, there's hundreds of different cultivars or varietals.
So is it to say that if you're growing a culinary one, it can't be used for essential oils or another purpose, or it's just not best for that application?
There's some cultivars that have crossovers that make wonderful essential oils and also are great for culinary purposes. And then there's others that just may not be. So say a lot of times like lavandins will be more camphorous. They'll have higher levels of terpenes and camphor in them. So it's not that it's a poisonous plant, it's that it would be off-putting to cook with per se. So you wouldn't want to cook with that particular species or cultivar within that species. Whereas like a true lavender, within that, there's cultivars that have more floral notes in it or more mint notes to it. Lavender is related to the mint family, so there's a lot of attributes when you're cooking with it that can have like a mint note to it. And so that would be how you make those choices.
Okay. So for the most part, is there a variety of lavender that can be grown in most areas? I would assume probably not in the extremes, but kind of the most common growing zones?
Yeah, I would say true lavender does well. Again, the growing requirements for lavender, whether regardless of the species, would be 6 to 8 hours of full sun, good drainage. So it's really key. It doesn't like to be. It likes to dry out between waterings. You may have problems with root rot diseases if you're growing it in a place where you get a lot of rain and you don't have opportunity for the soils to dry out. And then as far as your pH of your soil, it's pretty much a 6.5 to 7, all the way to 7.5. And in some areas of our farm, we're 7.5 to 8 in our pH levels. And so those would be, the growing requirements for lavender. And I would say true lavender would be like I mentioned, would be the most hardy. In generally speaking, that would be one that you could grow potentially, depending on the cultivar, in little microclimates in, say, a 4B, 5A, 5B, all the way up to a zone 9. But you do need those conditions of full sun and good drainage. and kind of a more on an alkaline side of the pH level of your soils.
What would be some common pests or problems? You mentioned root rot, but other ones that might be kind of common with lavender?
There aren't a lot of ones. And again, it depends on your region. In our area, we have alfalfa mosaic virus, and that would be one that we have to worry about in our region. But across the United States, people have different issues. So we don't have the issue of root rot or phytophthora because we're a very dry climate and we have good drainage. We don't get lots of rain, and it is a drought tolerant plant, so it can resist those kind of conditions that was very common in Colorado and in the Southwest, in parts of California. But I know in some areas they have some issues with spittlebug. I haven't seen that in our area, but there's not a lot of, really, that's what's amazing about lavender. It is a pretty resilient plant. There aren't a lot of disease issues. I would say, phytophthora would be one that is of concern in certain parts of the country.
And then, so you, I would assume, grow your lavender organically with the name Sage Creations Organic Farm?
Yes, we do. We've been, certified organic from the very beginning. And it's just because a lot of it is what I believe in terms of sustainable growing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also what I know, even I've always worked in organic farms and organic gardening. So for me, it was an easy transition to transition our farm into being a certified organic operation. And again, I think lavender, is one of the crops that is actually fairly easy to grow sustainably and organically. Our biggest issue really is weed control, and that would be our number one pest issue per se, is being able to control our weeds, because it is a perennial crop. It's a long-term crop. You have to look at lavender when you're growing it. It's like growing an orchard or a vineyard. You're going to your plan is to put it in there for the long term. So you have to figure out how are you going to mitigate weeds. And if you have weeds growing inside your shrub or around your shrub, that can really be detrimental to your yields and the overall health of that plant in terms of how vigorous it can grow. So your weed control is key, and it's probably one of our largest challenges in growing organically.
What are some of the solutions that you found for that? Do you just manually pick them, or do you use anything else?
We do a lot of hoeing.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and I've done over the years, and it's still something I'm always trying to become better at and figure out labor-saving techniques and that thing. But we do use a lot woven weed fabric, and depending on where we're growing it on our farm, how we place that weed fabric can vary, whether it be in between the furrows or in the rows, or on the actual beds, and then where you burn a hole in your fabric and then plant your shrub. Using cover crop in the furrows to basically suppress your weeds also can help. Really, and the beauty about lavender is we use all drip irrigation, so I only direct the water where I want it to go. So that can also limit how much weeds you do have come up. So if we just limit it to the bed and to where that root zone of that plant is growing is where we're placing that water. We will have like a weed crew, depending on the year and how wet our spring is, either 2 to 3 times for that growing season come in. We just weed the entire fields. We have multiple hula hose and replacement parts and files, and that's our, and I'll try to get a weeding crew together about 3 times a year. But if we have rain or a lot of rain in the springtime, that sometimes we'll have to add a once through to that.
Sure. So you mentioned that the lavender was a long-term plant. How long do they normally live?
Well, what I am finding, I guess again, it depends on your growing zone, where you are in the United States. Here in Colorado, what I'm finding is the lavendins, or what's like the hybrid, which is also called Lavandula ex intermedia. And again, that's the cross between the true lavender and the spike lavender. That's the lavender that has the long stems. It has higher levels of camphor and terpenes. So it has a very kind of more of a eucalyptus, really strong smell, and it lasts a lot longer in terms of the scent. That plant I am finding is not as cold hardy. You'll get some dieback, but it's about on a farm level, not necessarily in your garden that has like a little microclimate, but on a like if you're doing row crops and out there in the field, it's about 8 years.
Oh wow.
Lifespan until you realize the yields start going down. You have a lot of dieback on your shrub that I decided to pull it out and start over. Now the true lavenders, I have plants that I've planted here since we started our farm, 16 years ago, that are the same original plants, or some that are 14 years old.
Wow.
Again, the last 2 years have been pretty tough in terms of weather. And I think it's been a little bit harder on our plants. We've had, really drought conditions and early freezes that have affected the growth of the plant that I haven't seen before. So, it really depends, like with farming anything, our weather is becoming less and less predictable, that sometimes you lose plants earlier than you in the past maybe wouldn't have.
Yeah, I've noticed that struggle here in southern Colorado as well. What about fertilizing? Do you use any fertilizers on your plants?
So if when I prep a field, I will, see what the requirements of the soil are. I do like to add compost, since we have heavy clay, just to improve on the organic matter. I like to do a cover cropping before planting a new field and adding compost. So a lot of it is in my preparation when I plant a new field. As far as ongoing, I'm finding as we age, as the plants are aging, it is helpful to have some kind of fertilizing regimen. And since I farm organically, I'll use organic fertilizers, like fish emulsions and humic acids. It just depends on what what I feel like the plants need at that time.
So they're not really a heavy feeding plant typically?
No, not at all. They're not a heavy feeder at all. And, you'll find that you don't really have to even start fertilizing your plants until maybe the fourth or fifth year. I mean, again, it depends on your soil prep and, what your soil condition. There's so many variables. But I do find with aging plants, it can help to fertilize.
Sure. So what about harvesting? How does that work? Do you normally get just one harvest a year? And when you do harvest them, what's kind of the work involved with that, I guess?
Well, again, it depends on what you're harvesting for. So
Sure.
If you're harvesting for fresh bundles, or even fresh bundles that then you're going to dry for dried bundles, or for dried flowered buds, then you're going to be harvesting by hand and making it into a bundle and then hanging it upside down on a drying rack in a drying room or space, so to speak. It depends on, again, your growing zone and the species and the cultivar in terms of how many harvests will you get from that particular plant. So for a true lavender, you can get anywhere, depending on the cultivar, anywhere from 2 to 4 harvests. And there's some that are just what we call double bloomers. So a double bloomer would be a plant that would fully bloom like in the early summer, and then fully bloom again in the early fall. And again, that would say maybe would be typical what would be in our region or here in Colorado. That, if you're somewhere in a little warmer climate, you can even get more than that. So we get, say, 2 harvests, or one really strong harvest and then a relatively, a little bit of smaller of a second harvest. Now on the hybrids, the ex intermedias, you would generally speaking, here again in our state, we get about a one full harvest. So where the plant is fully in bloom, the entire shrub is bloomed out, and that you would get one solid harvest. And then you may get some secondary bloom, with a few stems coming out, from your plant. You can harvest it or, maybe go through and pick some for fresh cut or for dried flowers or something like that. But for my purposes, I leave that for the pollinators and let them have it, because at that point, I'm done with the lavendins or the hybrids. I just have the one harvest for the season. I think if you're growing it on a commercial crop, or you want to actually, to have it as a cash crop and it's not just a plant in your garden, that there is planting involved, and you need to understand the spacing and the growth habit of each plant, and then understanding what your purpose is. Why do you want to grow the lavender? What do you want to sell? Sometimes you won't know for sure. Sometimes like for me, it kind of evolved over time, especially once I saw the characteristics and the workability of some of these different varieties. But, is to at least have some idea before planting is, what are your interests? What kind of market do you want to pursue? Because not every lavender plant is the same. And they might be great just to have in your garden, but commercially they're not really worth the time. It's just taking up valuable space, especially if you have little space, which, like I do, and a lot of small growers and hobby farmers do.
Sure. So I know that you sell plants, so I assume that if somebody was wanting to get into this, they could reach out to you and you could help guide them as to which ones would be best for their application.
Yes, I do. I have on my website, sagecreationsorganicfarm.com, I do have a whole section and a blog about lavender. I mean, I talk about other things as well, but lavender is definitely predominantly the information on my website in terms of growing and choosing different varieties. Our plant list is on there, and it will kind of tell you the attributes, the zones, the spacing requirements. And I do list some which ones are great to cook with, which ones are great to distill for the essential oils. So I have a lot of that on my website. There's a lot of great resources out there, though, as well. Michigan State University came out the first of the year of last year with a tutorial on growing lavender, especially if you're interested in being a lavender grower, growing it commercially. I highly recommend that. And there's different modules of all the way from, starting up your business plan to you planting your fields and harvesting and processing. And then through the United States Lavender Growers Association is a great organization as well. And they have a closed, Facebook grower group where a lot of growers, post questions, and people have a great kind of conversations of, different things that people are thinking about in terms of whether it be growing or processing or packaging or all kinds of things. And then here in Colorado, we have just become now a state organization. It used to be just the Western Slope, but it's the Colorado Lavender Growers Association. And those are all great resources for people to seek out, as well. Like I said, my website, I talk a lot about lavender. So, in choosing plants or calling or email me, I'm always happy to help. I do have a grower class in spring for, people that are interested as well. This last year, we had to do it kind of a hybrid. We did virtual and then an in-person once we started our harvest in the middle of our harvest in July. So I broke it up in two parts, and I may be probably doing the same thing this year as well.
Okay, great. And if I read correctly, you also have some products available, and then folks can also come out and visit the lavender farm?
Yes, definitely. So we open, our season starts with our greenhouses, where we have lavender plants and also all kinds of other bedding plants and flowers and herbs and medicinal herbs. But We start at the end of April. The 1st of May is when our greenhouse is open and our farm stand opens for the season. And even if you're just a gardener wanting to have lavender plants in your garden, you could come and, read about and see all the different plants that we have to offer. And then our farm is open as well during bloom time, which is mid-June, through July, and people can come out and see the blooming fields, pick your own lavender. We have all kinds of events during that time as well, during the bloom time. People can enjoy the fields and the gardens.
Wonderful. And so, of course, we'll put the link to your website and the resources that you mentioned in the show notes so that people can reach out to you and access those other resources as well. But Paola, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your time with me today and talking about lavender.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And for those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us for another episode. If you do enjoy our episodes, please check out our show notes where we have a link to sign up to get episodes sent directly to your inbox every week. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.
For more from Backyard Bounty, text the word podcast to 719-292-3207 or visit heritageacresmarket.com/podcast. See you again next week.